Hello and welcome to the SASSE library. Whether you've downloaded the free sample or the complete library, you should receive a zip file. So you're going to need to unzip that file, and then the folder that it produces, that is the library folder. So you can place that folder wherever you like on your system, wherever you store your assets. And then once that's done, you can open up Blender. We're here in Blender 4.1. We're going to navigate to Edit, Preferences, and then go to File Paths. And you can see I have both installed already. Of course, you won't see that the first time. You'll have to click on the plus button, navigate to wherever you store your library, and then you can click Add Asset Library. At that point, it will show up down here. If you have the full library, it'll just say SASSE. If you have the sampler, it'll say SASSE Sampler. And then it shows you the path down here, gives you the import method. You can consult the Blender documentation for that, whether you want to append or link objects. You can also change that from within the asset browser. So once that's done, you can close Preferences, and then we can start using the library. So the library will include a starter scene that has a number of settings that are preset for the best results with the shaders. But I'm going to go through those settings right now quickly because there's not too many of them, but it's good to know if you're ever starting from scratch how to quickly set it. So I'm not super concerned about the number of render samples here, so I'm just going to drop that down to 16. It won't really affect what we're doing with the stylized rendering. I'm going to enable Ambient Occlusion, Bloom, Screen Space Reflections, and Refraction. I'm going to go down to Shadows. I'm going to make these the largest they can be. Click High Bit Depth, Disable Soft Shadows, and then we're going to go down to Color Management and set that to Standard. So those are the basic scene settings. Then we just have to make one more change with our current scene before it's ready for stylized results. We'll click on the light. We're going to change the light type to sun, and we're going to change the strength to 5. So I've seen a value of 2 given for a stylized sun a lot. I've just found that the best results seem to come with a strength of 5 for me. We're going to keep the shadow enabled for now. This is going to be something that you will have to turn off and on. And I have a number of lights that are packed into the library, and they're basically standard scene lights. The only reason that I put them in there is that they have shadow and contact shadows enabled, and the bias setting turned either all the way up or all the way down, which is typically what I find I need to do to mask some of those little artifacts that you get in shadows sometimes. Okay, and with all that done, we are now ready to use the library, but of course we can't see it anywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the timeline area up a little bit just to make it a little bit larger. I'm going to go over to this clock icon here, click on that, and I'm going to switch it to Asset Browser. Now this will bring up every asset that you've got, but here on the left side we can see there's a handy little shortcut, a little menu, so we can click SASSE Library, and that'll show us just the items of the library. You can see the sampler is down below, or the built-in hair library assets. So we click on SASSE Library. It's still pretty hectic. And by the way, if you can't see this this here, you can press T on your keyboard or go to View and Source List. So what we're going to do is we're going to click the drop down here, and this shows us all the categories we have, which will make it a little bit easier to navigate. So we can click Assets, and now we can see all the assets that are included in the library. Again, it has a further drop down for draw curves. So these are Bezier curves or Bezier curves that you draw with a pen tool that are then populated with these 3D objects. Ground planes, these would be flat planes that are warped and distorted to be different types of ground. So we've got grass, sand, and water. Then we have objects, and these are more or less static objects. They have customizability. Actually, I think the foliage does have a little animation, but generally they're pretty static objects. Next up, we have effects. So again, this is a pretty broad category. It's got a drop-down arrow. We've got background effects for going in behind a character, electric effects, energy, fire, foreground effects for going in front of the character, Gore effects, impact, light, rain, reactions. So these are more like the super deformed, cutesy reactions that you might see in anime. Smoke effects, and trails that follow behind an animated object. Then we have lights. These are just standard scene lights that have that bias setting enabled, so you can quickly go and crank it up or down if you need to. Linework doesn't have very many items, but there are a couple of different categories in there. Geometry node based lines and grease pencil lines. So if you wanted a simple outline, just what you would call the inverted hull method, you can just drag and drop, and now it's a single action to give you that inverted hull look. It might be easier to see with a different background. Yeah, there you go. Okay, and then we have materials. Once again, this is a pretty broad category, broken down into 5 specific subcategories. Base are the main shaders, so all of the shaders, all the rest of the shaders in this library are either based on one of these 5 shaders, or they are just a simple emissive shader. The Toon Diffuse General was the basis for all the others. So this is included in the main library and in the free sample pack. This is going to give you the best idea of what this library does and whether it is for you or not. So speaking of what it does and whether it's for you, let's look at the features of the shader. Okay, I've drafted Suzanne in here to help us, and we're going to drag and drop the shader onto her. And if we see it doesn't show up, this is a weird little quirk. Just remove that. And now we can see the Toon shader. So I'm going to take our sun and I'm going to rotate it a little bit just to give me a slightly more pleasing shape on those shadows. So there, that's something that looks a little better. I think it shows off the shader a little more. So what are the features of this shader? So far it seems pretty standard. Pretty bog standard Toon shader. We have a rim light, we have a main area, and then we have a shadow. And I just dropped that same simple outline object on it to give us an outline. So we have here a light threshold. So this is going to determine ultimately how many bands of light you have, but it's not a one-to-one comparison. So I don't have 8 bands of light if the number is set to 8. But as you can see, as I increase it, there are more and different bands. So 10 is the max, and you can see we're getting almost like an aliased effect because there are so many different shades. So as we turn that down, the shader becomes less sensitive to light, and we also have fewer of those bands. So you can crank it all the way down until there's nothing left. I found the sweet spot seems to be around 8, so that's the default setting. Rim light you can increase or decrease. So you can turn this up and you can actually get an emissive glow from this. So this has a bit of a side effect too. If you have a light that's too close, sometimes it can actually overload the emissive area and it can start to turn black. If that's the case, you can actually disable that within the shader. So I'll figure out a better solution for this in the future, but you can just clamp the value of the rim light. Now, as you can see, it doesn't do that emissive overloading anymore, which is something that I found I kind of liked. It does add a little bit of a stylized sort of peeping through a narrow door kind of thing. So you can overload it, but if it starts to blow out, then you'll have to clamp it, and at that point, you're not able to overload it anymore. But that is just an option. You can leave it set to sort of a normal amount. 1 there, I like to push it a little even just for the standard rim. And then we've also got the mask. So right now you can see the rim light is limited to where the light is hitting. We can turn it off and the rim light covers the entire object. Also has a slightly different feel in the shading. That is up to you to customize. Next, we can enable or disable ambient occlusion. So you can see it's a fairly subtle effect when we just turn it on. You can see it around the eyes and the ears. So it is up to you. This is not necessarily a true Toon shading effect. The way I tend to look at it is, you know, once airbrushing started coming into animation, you did start to see some of these like softer gradations. But if you're going for like a more classic Toon, obviously that's not a part of it. but we can also turn up the depth of it if we want, and yeah, crank it to a point where it's just truly hideous. So we'll turn that back down, turn that off. Next we have shadow depth. So this will determine how dark your shadows are. You can crank it all the way up and make them completely black, which gives another kind of stylized, like a noirish look. I find 0.5 is usually my sweet spot. Then you can also basically turn any of these shaders emissive by raising this value above 1. So we can crank it right up, back to 1, and of course 0 is black. So the emissive step happens after all of this shading, so you can still retain all of the shading, the shadows, the light angle, even with the emissive. And then the last up, we have the surface and light band areas. So these are all bump or normal related inputs. So again, this is not necessarily something that is exactly Toonish, but you can get a couple of different effects out of it that I think are very interesting. So if you want to use this, you're going to be going into the shader editor, and you're going to be adding images or image textures to these inputs. So just as an example, we'll take your basic noise, we'll plug it into the surface, give it a second to compile, and then we can see we're altering the surface of Suzanne, and we can change this up or down, and we're basically like giving the surface of the mesh, the normals of the mesh, this rippled appearance. So that is what surface does. You can change the surface normals via a bump node. So texture is fed into a bump node, and that will affect the surface normal. You can also do this to the light band normal. So this is going to be something that will be more Toonish. So the first one is good for stuff like chips and damage. Actually, let's maybe demonstrate that first. So we'll put this in here, and let's say we want to have just, little like scrapes and bumps or little divots in Suzanne. We'll crank this right up. And then, yeah, we don't want them everywhere, so... And this will give that appearance of like, little flecks of maybe little pebbles are hitting and chipping off. So that's something that I do find is an okay use for that surface input, even if you want to maintain the Toon look. But if you want to maintain a more faithful Toon look, you can just apply it to the light bands. So you can see the surface of the mesh is not being distorted, but just the edge of the light is. And if we turn this down or up, you can see that is moving. And then the same for the rim light. So they're two separate inputs so that you can determine how much you're affecting each. So you can see the shadow here does have it, the rim light does not. And then as we turn it up, we apply that same texture to the rim light as well. And you can see it all over here. We'll turn that back down again. And then it's just a plain rim light. The library also comes with a number of seamless textures that you can apply. So we'll go back to the asset browser here, and I'm just going to pop the browser out. And we'll click down here. We'll go to node groups. You can see them here already, but there is a category with just seamless textures to keep them separate from some of the other node groups in there. So let's take this dry brush. We are going to need to supply it a texture coordinate. So I will do that. We'll just give it the generated one. And then let's apply this to the light band instead. So we'll get rid of the old noise texture, the old color ramp. And now we can see this is a pretty extreme, and maybe it's too big. So let's scale this up. But now you can see we have the same breakup along the lines of the shadow, but instead of being just a procedural noise texture, now it is this dry brush texture. It's a seamless looping, repeating texture that I created in Krita using the brush of the same name. And something like this can also be animated so that you can have this changing over time. Okay, and those are the main features of the shader inside the editor. And there is just one more feature yet to show, and that is the shaders also work with colored light. So we will turn this up a little. And you can see, in addition to the white light that we have from the sun that's casting to give us the shadow and the rim light, we now have a blue light affecting our object. So we'll move that closer, we'll move it farther away, and you can see on the rim, it's actually interacting with the other light and causing a slightly different hue to form. So we'll change this color. Now we've got a green into a yellow, into a red, and then pink is shows up a little bit. It's a pink object. Back into blue, into green. You can have multiple lights at the same time. Again, these are just regular lights, nothing special. Red, blue. Get another one down here. Go green. So all the lights affecting the shader, and any shader that is based on any of these 5 shaders, which is the majority of them in there, will be able to receive colored light. And then again, you can go back to your object, turn up or down the banding if you feel like it's getting too intense or it's not the effect that you want. You know, and then if you crank it way up, this almost looks to me like an aliased kind of PlayStation 1 kind of texture when you get up to too many bands of light. But that is the SASSE shader system in a nutshell. So the main shaders are in base. The background shaders are very similar to the main shaders, but they, let's see, remove that. They lean more heavily into those aspects like ambient occlusion, anything like the soft sort of graded fade between things. So you can see there are color bands here, but they're much softer, and the transition between them is very soft and broken up. So that is the distinction between the background shaders and the base. The base are going to be those clean, hard lines with the light and the shadow. The background are going to be those soft, smooth changes between one and the other to help offset the background objects versus the focal objects of the characters. We also have a specialty shader section. Now, these don't necessarily work with the colored lights, but they are different kind of effects that I have seen and I thought were worth presenting or worth preserving. Then we've also got the foliage and the individual assets, and these are more reference, I would say. Actually, the foliage is intended to work with the foliage planes asset. So you can see here, foliage planes, and it provides a number of different materials that you can use to get different leaves, different tree types and patterns. So those are ones that you can just drag and drop into your scene once you're using the foliage planes. The individual assets are the actual materials that are used by all of the different assets in the library. They typically have their settings set through attributes. So it's not like when I click on Suzanne when she's got the diffuse shader on, and I have this whole list of settings that I can tweak. These will generally be set up so that everything lives in the geometry nodes modifier panel. Like you can see for the simple outline here, we can choose the material, we can choose the color, the thickness. So all of these things will be tied via attributes to this panel here instead of being available as a regular material. So if you want to use any of these, if you want to modify any of these, you need to ensure that you go into the shading tab and remove the attributes. Let's say we wanted it to be this impact cylinder material. You're going to see it's black because we go into shading and there it is. The color is currently being set by an attribute tied to the geometry, and Suzanne does not have any attributes for color. You can add one, but you can also just disconnect it and choose the color yourself. So this is, again, an effect shader not really mapped to the object that we have it applied to, but that is what the individual asset folder is there for. Just a reference for any object, any material that you think, hey, I want to try that. I want to put that on something else. You can pull it apart and do whatever you need to. And the last category here is node groups. So we saw a little preview of this already. The alphas are what the foliage materials use to give you the different types of leaves, different types of trees. Seamless textures are those repeating traditional art patterns created in Krita. Shaders are the node groups for the base and background shaders. So again, you can mix and match. You can just drag and drop these directly into the shader editor to create your own custom materials. And then utility is, this will be an expanding category as I refine my techniques, but right now it has two primary utilities. One of them is this TimeStep group here. Let's go straight into that, actually. So here we are in our shader editor, and let's focus our node. So I'm going to select all with A, press the period on the number pad to focus. And actually, you know what, before we get into using our textures, let's use a procedural texture to demonstrate this because it'll show us a little difference. So I'm hitting Control-T with the noise texture selected. That is a Node Wrangler shortcut, so you'll need Node Wrangler enabled. But let's go to our utility section here, and we'll get TimeStep SN, so SN for shader nodes. We pull this in, and we can see we've got, actually let's zoom in on this here, 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. So this is a node that will give you stepped motion. Something that will update only every frame, every other frame, every third frame, or every fourth frame. So like you would see in TV animation, it's often animated on 2s, so like 12 FPS. You can maintain your project frame rate. Let's see, where is our project frame rate? There it is. So we can maintain our project frame rate 24 frames per second, and we can switch between any of these that we need to give that that sort of classic animated motion. So let's get a combine. We'll plug this into the X, and we will use this for the light band input. Okay, now when we hit play, we can see it's sort of wobbling a little. So that noise texture is quite large, so let's scale it up so we can see some of those fine lines. Looks a little bit more like a messy brush stroke now. And so we hit play, and we can see these moving every frame. We switch this to 2s, and now we can see it's a little choppier, moving every other frame. Go to 3s. You can see it's that much choppier. 4s. And now let's see that versus 1s again. 2s, 3s, and 4s. Okay, so that's with our procedural texture. Now let's try that same thing with our seamless texture. Plug that into location, and nothing is happening. And why is nothing happening? Because this is an image texture. So anytime we supply it a complete integer, meaning a whole number, not a decimal number, it's going to go back to essentially the original place it's at again. So if we see dry brush, this is essentially, you know, this texture at 0, 0, and this texture at 1, 1, and this texture at 2, 2, and 3, 3. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, it's okay. It's what's happening is because we are getting the frame, every frame or every other frame, every third frame, it is always going to be a whole number. So what we want to do is we want to multiply this, and I usually just get it 1/10, and that usually will do the trick. Anything that's not a whole number will give you the result you want. So we hit play, and away she goes. So we can see the texture is now animating every fourth frame, or it's updating every fourth frame. 3s, 2s, 1s, back to 4s, and if it's moving too much, you can adjust the amount that it moves, and then the scale of the texture also. We can go for bigger or smaller, depending on the effect that you're going for. And we can see it affecting the lights and the banding all across the material.